Hi.
evening, everyone. As you just heard, this meeting is being recorded for future views on Stow TV. Hello from Denver. I'm actually away this week, but I'm here to host Sustainable Stow. I'm Tina McAndrew. I'm the library director, and Sustainable Stow and the library have been partnering for 2 years now and going strong. And I'm thrilled to be here tonight. Just a couple of housekeeping things. If you could keep yourself on mute unless you have a question, but feel free to also raise your virtual hand or put your question in the chat, and we'll keep an eye on it. And so without further ado, I'll hand it over to Rick to introduce our speaker tonight.
Thank you, Tina. So we have a great speaker tonight, Peggy MacLeod, who is, let's say, a partner in crime with Amy Meltzer, who some of you heard last month. So last month, Amy talked to us about natural solutions to the climate crisis. So we were talking about native plants. Peggy's session tonight builds upon that by talking about how certain kinds of plants benefit pollinators, and pollinators are what makes the world go round, basically. And we've had recent reports that suggest that the pollinator population is in serious threat. So and she may talk about that, I'm not sure. So we need to make sure that we do all we can to support pollinators. So I'm going to just briefly, she also has co-founded the Western Mass Pollinator Networks and helped launch the Massachusetts Pollinator Network. We are hoping to put Stow on the map of that pollinator network in the coming months. And that's something we're going to be working on. We're going to work on it at Springfest and in the months to come. So welcome, Peggy.
Thank you.
Glad you're here to join us.
I am now going to do that magical thing called screen sharing. And then I have to start my presentation. Somehow I'm not on the first slide.
Now you are, I think.
No, this is it.
Oh, there it is.
But, okay, I'm going out of that. The screen sharing thing is in the way. Okay, here we go again. That's better.
Love the picture you used.
Just random. It's just kind of random, you know.
It looks like that right now. It's beautiful.
Oh, that's true. Well, good evening, everybody. I'm happy to be here and happy to follow in Amy's footsteps. And we're, just part of a big network of people that try to make a step-by-step change and improvement. And one thing that I became aware of, I used to be on our energy committee here in Northampton, and we were about sustainability, but we only talked about building. It seemed like we only talked about buildings and energy use. Like that's it for sustainability. We never spent any time on nature. So I think now there's a lot more attention coming to the status of biodiversity, and that our landscaping choices, have an impact in improving biodiversity and the wildlife habitat. We're cohabiting with wildlife wherever we live. And we're becoming more and more aware that without wildlife, that's so important just to our own existence. So tonight I'm going to focus on, how we can harness like a huge potential for improving biodiversity using the native trees, native shrubs, and native plants. And, humans are so into modifying everything for their own use. And it doesn't always lead to it's good for everybody. It might lead to it's good for that person or that crowd. So we're going to be talking more about these native flora and fauna and how important they are. So biodiversity is talked of in 3 different ways. The species diversity, meaning, the number of different species you might have in a desert, let's say, there are some you don't see and a lot you do see, but you know, how many species are there in that particular ecosystem? Genetic diversity is the variation, the natural variation within species, biological variation, and that slight variation is going to create more resiliency. If everything was exactly the same, one disease could come and wipe everything out. But when there's a slight diversity, there's more chance for resiliency. And ecosystem diversity is, you know, what variety of ecosystems you have in any one area. I recently went to a birding festival in Cottonwood, Arizona. And just on this one small area, I mean, you think of Arizona, it's all hot, it's all dry, blah, blah, blah. But we went into many different kinds of ecosystems and habitats. So I learned a lot in doing that because the same birds were not in all of those habitats. So it was really pretty interesting. So, oops, that always happens. So nature is organized so everything gets their needs met. That's how nature works. We know that doesn't happen with humans. We try to organize something and we mess it all up. So it's really important to get into tune with nature and how it likes to organize. And insects are, what did you say, Rick? Like without insects, everything goes away or everything is affected or whatever. But for example, insects provide free ecological services, which it is said are worth billions and billions of dollars. And the rest of the slide does not show up. All right, I have to go somewhere. I don't have control.
Let me see.
Okay,
There you go.
There.
all right. Well, I'm just going to read. You know, insects, they, of course, food crops, they aerate the soil, they preserve biodiversity because they're such a variety. They're food for many species, biological cleanup. So all these services that are given free from insects, we benefit from, and we don't pay anything. So we have to preserve them. And how the loss of one species affects wildlife and biodiversity is really important. Insects are disappearing at an alarming rate, and they say since 1970, about 75% of the biomass of all insects has disappeared, the biomass. That doesn't mean all the species. But if we lose either a plant or an insect, we don't know how that one species loss would affect the rest of the ecosystem because it's all intertwined, and you know, other species are getting their needs met through the plant or the insect that might be lost. And of course, they're a food source for frogs and other amphibians and reptiles and birds and mammals, so they're extremely important. One thing just to look into is what is causing this loss of biodiversity. And I have a small list. They're all big things. Of course, overconsumption, which doesn't really come from overpopulation, but we could overconsume even if we had an okay size that the planet could support. Use of pesticides, we're disrupting the climate with all our activities and that overuse, and corporate farming, which just takes up so much of the land, and it, you know, doesn't use nature's principles to do that large scale farming. So all of this is really affecting biodiversity in a negative way. And can anyone think of anything else that might be affecting biodiversity loss that isn't covered? Those are the big things, probably. So let's think about how we can enhance biodiversity. And in my mind, it begins with an appropriate mindset. We're not sitting at a computer trying to figure it out. It's what's our psychology? What's our spirituality? What's our brain helping us see? And there's a couple of different mindsets just to compare and contrast. This is my garden mindset. You know, it's all about me. Some of the thoughts we have when we garden, you know, what's going to bloom next spring? Oh, I think I need some taller plants for this fall, so I'm going to go buy them. I want some plants that will spread nicely to cover this area over here. And I don't know, what colors do I need? I need to get some more balance. So that's kind of one mindset. And it's a necessary one, but I would like to see us balance that with focusing on wildlife. What else do we have to consider when we're gardening and doing landscaping? We have to think about all the animals that need to be in that environment. My babies need larvae, they love it. That's all that baby birds are fed. Birds and bees and butterflies all get thirsty, so there has to be some kind of water source. What kinds of insects are overwintering? What kinds of wildlife overwinters, and what do they need for that habitat? How do they hide? How do they keep away from their predators? So we need to think of what we need to put in our landscape in order to support the needs of wildlife. So this is just kind of a list of ways to create sustainable wildlife habitats. And I put the Xerces folder on there because I want people to know how much, how many resources Xerces has. And to go to xerces.org. They have, you know, handouts and books and a lot of things are very free. So I recommend that. But some of the things we can do to improve wildlife habitat: reduce our lawn, keep hollow twigs and stems, and they can be used by insects to hollow out even further and lay their eggs in the hollow twigs and stems or overwinter in them. Don't get so nick oriented so you get every single leaf up, because leaves are important, and I'll say more about that later. Do less mulching. We mulch. Everything doesn't have to be as neat as a pin. Brush and rock piles are good. Rotting logs are great for harboring larvae and insects, and you see birds on them all the time looking for food. Fresh water, reducing night lighting. And this is something that your group could do, is let people know if you leave your lights on in the evenings and there's nocturnal pollinators, they're not going to pollinate. So the plants that they normally pollinate at night are not going to get pollinated, and they're not going to do what they are meant to be doing in nature. So those bright white porch lights are not good. Some people say having a more mellow light, like a yellow light, is okay. But do we really need to have lights on all the time? So I like the phrase to embrace scruffiness. And this is practice that, and these are just pictures of all those practices that I mentioned. It supports the creature's lifestyle when we're not so into everything neat as a pin. What are you talking about? Leaving leaf litter? I can't do that in my neighborhood. Someone will tell on me or complain. But the leaf litter is extremely important because invertebrates rely on all that organic debris to break down, and decaying leaves make better soil. They feed microorganisms. Queen bees usually overwinter and a lot of times use leaves for winter protection. the Carolina wren, the white-throated sparrow, a lot of the towhee. They look in the leaves, they're down in the leaves all the time looking for the insects that are harboring there. And then the box turtle is often using leaves for shelter and to find insects as well. So manicured lawns, all of us drive around and see these lawns all the time. It's important to have some kind of education about how non-native these lawns are. There's no biodiversity. If they're chemically produced, there's no food, there's no nectar. It's a biological desert basically, and wildlife is just not going to manage to survive on it. And then to add to that, a lot of times people plant non-native plants all around that non-native grass. So it's a big hassle. And in fact, lawns are the largest irrigated crop in the country. How many acres of lawns are there in the United States? Oh, there's only 40 million acres of lawn, or we could say turf grass. So some ideas to have a lawn, and the first one is only have one as large as you need. You don't probably need every single inch of every part of your lawn that you have now. Think about the needs you have for a lawn and reduce the size. Think about alternative lawn covers, ground covers. Alternative lawn like sedge is a good one. Self-heal has a little flower on it. Some kinds of clover might work in there. Wild strawberries. There's a lot of good ideas from Native Plant Trust and they actually have exhibits in Native Plant Trust and the Sami farms out here in Western Mass on what you can have for alternative lawn. Always avoid putting herbicides and pesticides on anywhere on your yard. And studies have shown, studies by UMass have shown that if you mow every 2 weeks, actually, mowing every 2 weeks is actually optimal for blooms in your yard, and also more blooms in your yard and more insects are able to find habitat and food there. If it's 3 weeks, the neighbors are going to complain, and probably you will too. So every 2 weeks seems to be optimum, and put the blades rather high. I think 3 inches, for instance. You can also create a native meadowing area, and you could have another presentation on that, probably by someone good at developing native meadows. So native plants, and I think Amy, you went into native plants quite deeply, but I'm reviewing here just that today, my friend Lola and she was going to pick up some annuals for her garden, and we went to one of the large, really nice nurseries here, and every single perennial was listed as, the name of the perennial, salvia, let's say, with a cultivar name after it, I guess you would say, in parentheses, no, in quotes. So everything they had for sale there was not a straight native plant. It had been modified. Native plants provide much better food for insects. The value of the nectar in the native plant is oftentimes at least 50 to 70% more nutritious than a cultivar. Native plants have evolved over thousands of years in that area with the local organisms, whereas plants that have been modified have not co-evolved in that environment. Oftentimes people find that with native plants, they adapt better to the local soil, and you don't have to put as much amendments on the soil. I never found this, that they require less weeding and watering and mulching. Yes, less watering. And I'll make a note here that plants that are good for meadows don't need a lot of water. They can have kind of poor soil. So that's a lesson that we can learn, that if we're using the right plant, it doesn't have to be a super rich soil. So the native plant versus the cultivar, the ones that are modified, and why are they better? They have more ecological value. For instance, the cardinal flower, I shouldn't have put it in quotes because I just said that means it's a cultivar. Lobelia cardinalis has the nectar value, which I don't even know how to read, but compared to the cultivar fan scarlet, the nectar value, it looks like it's about 1/8 the amount of the nectar value in the straight species on the left. And oftentimes you will see the insects not really go to the cultivar species as much as they would go to the native species. So the straight species have the optimal nectar. They're the host, they can be host plants for moths and butterflies. They can attract many pollinator species and also support the at-risk pollinators, which we find are dwindling faster than the ones that aren't so much at risk. And I'm glad to say, when I moved into my house 20 years ago, I went right for this bright pink aster. And I wasn't into pollinators then, but since then I've added this straight species New England aster because I know that's important. So host plants, I know Amy covered that last time, and they're plants that organisms live on and they live off of. So for instance, painted lady and pussy toes are together. The painted lady lays her eggs on the pussy toes. The monarchs will only lay their eggs on the milkweed plants, and then the caterpillars of the monarchs will munch those leaves till it's almost nothing left as they get really fat. And the black swallowtails love the dill, the rue, the fennel, and the parsley. And if you plant those things, you're going to have eggs laid on them in just a few days, because they somehow know how to hone in and find those plants. Keystone plants are really, really important, and the keystone plant supports an entire ecosystem, and it also supports the broad food web. So some of the keystone plants are the oaks, which I'll say a little more about. We have willows, birches, blueberries, asters, and goldenrod, and these species support hundreds and hundreds of wildlife species, insect species. So the oak tree, for instance, hosts over 400 caterpillar species. That's just amazing. The more caterpillars you have, the more birds. So that's good. And it's one of the most valuable wildlife food resources. So all kinds of vertebrates in the United States eat acorns and rely on them for food. Another really important principle, if we're going to preserve biodiversity, is to avoid anything with CIDE at the end. So pesticides, all of those. And the ones that we're extremely alarmed about are the neonicotinoids. They're neurotoxins. The studies have just shown that it disorients the bees. Sometimes they can't find their way back to their, well, for honeybees, can't find their way back to their hive. They can kill bees after they visit plants over a period of a couple of 5 days. You know, it could kill the bee. And then glyphosate or Roundup. Oh, it's safe. It's so safe. No, it isn't. And I would bet that almost every human in the United States has glyphosate in their bloodstream. It's just overused. Just at the slightest little, nub of a weed comes up, and people are spraying Roundup on it just to get rid of it. So really destroys the soil microorganisms. And without soil microorganisms, we get dirt. We don't have soil. We don't have nourishment. So we really need to think about how this ties into just how the ecosystem works, how biodiversity works. We can't always be putting these Band-Aids, these chemicals, and using them irresponsibly. So one caution is, you might go to a garden center, but the garden center relies on a bunch of different growers who have the seeds, and they plant the baby plants, and they host them for a while. This is all to make what humans would call perfect plants for their customers. So I recommend everyone always ask the garden centers and the nurseries, are your plants, your seeds, and your soil free of herbicides and pesticides? And a lot of times the staff at the cash register, they don't really know. So the Massachusetts Pollinator Network has created some lists of garden centers that we've contacted and talked to, and there is good news that quite a few of the growers have reduced or eliminated their use of these chemicals in the growing process. But we do need to do our due diligence, because it doesn't make sense to plant native plants that have killer pesticides in them. So now is sort of the second part of what I came to talk about, and that is, what are the practical applications for restoring biodiversity? And fortunately, we're not at square one. A lot of people are interested in doing just this, and it's fun and it builds community. So the way I'm going to talk about it is to start that humans have adopted many ways of traveling, and we got our bike paths, we have sidewalks everywhere, most of them broken down everywhere. Different kinds of roads, dirt roads, highways. We have so many ways of traveling, and pollinators have to travel also to survive. Right now, they are at the mercy of our development. So a lot of times our development has just broken up what they would normally see as where they want to forage and where they want to build their habitat. And let's think about pollinator pathways. They're vital for repairing these fragmented landscapes, creating what we could call a continuous buffet, a continuous place for bees to forage, and all pollinators and all wildlife for that matter. And building this pollinator resiliency, because we're regenerating a habitat that they would have had were we not to build buildings and pavement everywhere. So that's really what the aim is. The aim for pollinator pathways is how can we structure it in a way that nature would structure it? How can we use all the resources that we have to put back what we took away? So the example I probably know the best is the Northampton Pollinator Pathway, and it started with the concept of our bicycle map, our bicycle pathway map, and I saw it at the mayor's office in like 2016, and I was just getting into pollinators, and I thought, why, those purple dots could represent where we have gardens or something. So I took that map and I started Googling all over the internet and found that Seattle, Washington was really the first organized pollinator pathway, and read up about that, and just started to figure out how can we do this. So in Northampton, we used the concept of the pollinator pathway as a way to solve some of the city's little problems. For instance, one of the problems was they spent millions of dollars on their central park, the Pulaski Park, but they didn't have a maintenance budget. I mean, is that common in towns? Yes, it is. Let's raise money to put the plants in, to hire professionals. but what do? Nobody weeds it from the city. Nobody could replace the plants. So some of the original species that were planted in 2015, I believe, had died over several years. And so I had been talking to a local professional landscape designer and found out that he has a professional business that he charges money for, but he has this nonprofit where he volunteers to design some municipal and some public spaces. And then he organized and managed the plant replacement for this central garden, for the central park. It's basically a very long, like 200-foot long rain garden, or water runoff from the streets. And volunteers helped to plant it. In 2018, I think we planted about 600 plugs, and it was November 1st. So you know what plugs look like in that season. He got them dirt cheap. They're all scrawny or leggy, and we're all thinking, oh, but it was low cost. And the next year they were as big and robust as any expensive plant. So evidently he knew what he was doing. And it still looks great after all these years. Important, I should go back. The city does not weed this 200-foot by 6-foot garden. Volunteers maintain it. So if you're going to do any kinds of projects, you have to figure out the life cycle of the project. And it's fun. The ones that go down there to weed, they have a small group at that park and a couple of the others, and they contact each other. A couple of times, a couple of city councilors came to help. It's community building. And my opinion is that people like to be asked to do a community project. They're waiting to be asked. They're part of something. They have pride in their community. So I think these are important. The second problem is this slope beside the city hall was so steep that the lawnmowers, the people who mowed the lawn had to wear golf shoes. So it was a really pain, and it always looked terrible. So here's another one that the next weekend we planted half of the slope, and that was 500 plugs. It also looked terrible. Look how tiny those plugs are. You can barely even see them. And the next summer, the lower picture, it shows you how good it looked in less than a year. It looked fantastic. So I heard you, Rick, talking, I heard you talking about pollinator pathway. We like to use the term anchor plantings. So you were talking about a couple of churches and, maybe a municipal outside of City Hall. I like the term anchor plantings because if people are looking for one continuous pollinator pathway, it's really difficult to achieve that because you have to convince everybody along the way. But if you have some anchor plantings and have signage in them that just say, this garden's for pollinators, then people start to get what you're trying to do. You can use Google Maps to input the addresses of the gardens that the households participate in. The green dots in this map, kind of on the lower right quarter, those are the anchor plantings, and the yellow dots are the participants in people's houses. So a second example I want to give is the pollinator pathway on Cape Cod. So I don't know if you've been to the website pollinator-pathway.org, but on that website, which was set up by towns in Southern Connecticut, when you put in your address of your pollinator garden, it creates a Google map, like I just showed you. And then, so these are how many hundreds of gardens were participating on Cape Cod. And this didn't take long. They just started spreading it through garden clubs. Mass Audubon talked about it to their members. There were some sanctuaries, there were some business improvement districts. So quite a few different kinds of supporters got on board and were, again, waiting to be asked, and they were willing to participate. They don't ask too much to qualify to be on the pollinator pathway. They ask that you add more native flowers, you try to reduce your lawn a little bit, avoid chemical fertilizers and pesticides, and this is a must to do that. Don't neaten your property every fall and take up all the leaves. So it was a very few rules. They didn't want to make it super hard to participate. So they, on their website, they have plant recommendations, they have sources for native plants and videos and books. And an aside is that each of the towns and garden clubs all over the Cape kind of does their own thing. It isn't that somebody organized this so well that they're all coordinating everything. Now, Massachusetts Pollinator Network has lists, they have books, they have a lot of these resources, but things like the sources for native plants and also their plant recommendations sometimes pertain to a particular ecosystem, a particular kind of a habitat. So I think it's important for towns to either refer to an existing plant list or kind of hone down what they are recommending to their participants. They also, all over the Cape, adopted, they created the pollinator pathway sign, but they reprinted around the edges that it says Cape Cod. And then it seems like it's a coherent project. So another organization is Green and Open Somerville. This might be a little bit like Sustainable Stow. They've had a lot of community events, and they are concentrating on planting gardens with native species, weeding invasive plants, and installing. So there's a lot of paved areas, and they've tried to put some gardens and planters in those paved areas. And so one of the events was a self-guided native garden tour, which that sounds kind of neat, actually. And I think they had a kind of a map that you could go with bicycles, I was reading. And then they didn't have the money to put a lot of the native plant garden together in this large area. So they put up some temporary planters and signage that you know, people could see that it was coming. And, you know, there's just so much pavement everywhere. So decorating with native plants can be very sweet for a community to do something like that. They also had an invasive plant. I'm really impressed with this. They got a lot of volunteers to come out last year. Does that say June or July? I can't see it underneath the Zoom. But anyway, they had invasive plant removal sessions in people's yards, along streets, in public places. And I'm a little dismayed that Northampton hasn't started even saying anything about invasive plants. We should be teaching people how to recognize the babies of these invasive plants so they can begin to take care of it themselves. So I was impressed with what they did. Wellesley's very actively involved with garden tours, plant sales. They offer design advice and reading lists. And they also came up with a unifying signage. I haven't been pointing this out, but a number of these pollinator pathway areas have recruited other organizations. So Sustainable Wellesley's involved, and the Wellesley Conservation Land Trust. So some of the other towns had a number of different organizations that had a part in getting this off the ground, even if it's just getting information out to their members. That can be a big help. Another option is having a professional do some design work. One example is in Egremont, in their main park, French Park. Evan Abramson of Landscape Interactions created a pollinator garden design plan for them. And it has 3 separate different kinds of ecosystems: the upland meadow, which has the characteristics of full sun and dry to medium soils; woodland edges, which had some part shade and some medium soils; and a wet area, which had full sun or part shade, and it's moist to wet soils. And I think oftentimes home gardeners projects don't do as well because they don't think about what the ecosystem is there, or the microclimate in the corner of their building that gets more heat because the sun is beating off those walls. So I think having a professional involved, if you're able, is also an option. Uh-oh, having trouble turning the page again. Oh, okay. Great Barrington, I've always looked up to because they hired the Conway School of Landscaping Design to develop a pollinator action plan. And the way they set it up was really smart. It's 90 pages long, but it doesn't have fine print and technical, and it's also set up as a toolkit for any town to use. So it has sections on municipal plantings. It has sections on, or a section on riparian plantings. So I don't remember all the sections, but it's divided into different sections so people can pick and choose and get some ideas for a certain kind of project. And you can find it, just, search online for the Great Barrington Pollinator Action Plan. It's very accessible. All right, so I'm glad you all came, and I'm just giving information, but I think from what I heard at the beginning of, before we started the presentation, you're already making some headway into some, the seeds of some projects that are starting in Stow. And pollinator pathway might be one way you could think of it. But what might you want to organize a pollinator pathway, because it is going to regenerate that habitat for wildlife, for birds and beneficial insects. You're going to have better seasons of beauty instead of just having annuals that look the same all year. If you start to organize a pollinator pathway, you'll have those perennials that bloom at different times and attract different kinds of birds. I think the pollinator pathway helps us develop a deeper connection to our land, because we're focused on what can we do for wildlife. And that can be part of your educations. What can we do for wildlife? It isn't just, wow, we have this you can have so many ways of thinking of your pollinator pathway, that it's beautiful, we can enjoy it, or let's really go and observe and see what's happening there. Let's see how many different species of bees we can count on the plants. I don't know if any of you have been to Shelburne Falls, where they have help me out here, Amy, Bridge of Flowers.
Right.
So they have, I would say, 300-foot long bridge that goes over the river, and it's a walking bridge. It's only about 10 feet wide, and on both sides of the walkway are hundreds and hundreds of species of perennials, and shrubs, mostly perennials, but there's some shrubs, some small trees, and it's a huge attraction for people to go there in the summertime. So it's, you know, and you can really see what's been done by the hands of volunteers. Another reason is the less yard you have around your municipal buildings, you're going to reduce the cost of mowing. And I've never really seen one of our Massachusetts towns plan, you know, okay, here's what our budget for mowing is. Let's see how we can cut it by a third by reducing the size of the, you know, by mowing less and reducing the size of our landscaping areas. I've never seen a town actually do that, but it is possible. It is possible to work through that, because if the staff, for instance, isn't mowing every week, every Monday or every Tuesday, then that staff is available to do other things. So you're really improving your ratio of projects to municipal staff. So next steps for Stow. And I would be very interested to, you know, have some dialogues with people on some ideas, and maybe Amy will be around to do that as well. But we're going to target biodiversity enhanced yards, which are more resilient to the changing climate, where they're going to have more native flowers and trees. And think about our home, whether it's in the city or on the suburbs or on the edges, it still can be a wildlife habitat, not just our property. And thinking about our towns to become more of a shelter and for insects and wildlife and birds, because we're approaching it with that kind of a mindset. This is what I look like when I'm when I'm gardening for pollinators. So thank you very much. And I would like to entertain any discussion or questions. I should stop sharing.
Thank you, Peggy. You've given us some challenges. I'd be interested to hear what our other guests here, what questions different folks have.
You know, everyone wasn't here, Rick, when you started talking about the seeds of what you've seen happening with the church, a couple churches. I don't think everyone on the call heard you say all of that. So, okay,
so in Stow right now, we've got the beginnings of projects to build better pollinator habitats at First Parish, which is going to get that you're going to see that early next month. We're going to plant a specific garden for pollinators. It's right on Main Street, so you can right on 117. We don't call it Main Street, right on 117. So you see it. The St. Isidore's, the Catholic Church, just asked me today about, well, could we be part of the pollinator pathway? And I also, and I mentioned, we just heard, Carol can say more, that we heard more from our town administrator. Why don't we plant native plants in front of our town building rather than just the usual whatever that gets bought and planted there? And so those are three opportunities, and they're all within half a mile of each other. And then we have one person, and Dave Weber is here, who lives on Red Acre Road, which must run for, I don't know, a mile and a half, one side of town, where there's a good chance that there's going to be a series of residences signing on to build and add pollinators to their yards. You know, Dave, I don't know if you have any comments on progress so far. Maybe not.
well, one thing I've heard towns talk about is, and you probably have done this, but who cuts the grass? Which department cuts the grass? Which department would buy a shrub if, you know, one died and a new one was needed in front of the municipal garden? It's like all this stuff that happens behind the scenes. How can that be coordinated? And in Northampton, we have a guy who's responsible for all the buildings, and then the yards around the buildings, and another department is responsible for all the playing fields and the cemeteries and the parks. So we had to have discussions with those two departments, who were very willing. For instance, if we needed mulch for a new garden, they'll get you some mulch. If you want to do the weeding, leave it in a pile and call them and tell them to take away the weeds. So there was some coordinating that took a couple years to get together, but it's good when the left hand knows what the right hand is doing, and they appreciate it.
That's good. So Stow's got about a population of maybe 7,500, probably smaller than Northampton. And so we ought to be able to reach out and touch all those departments. And we got to do more of that. Carol.
I was wondering if any of these towns have created or put native plants in their cemeteries. Because like I used to be in a hiking group that twice a year we would go to Mount Auburn Cemetery in Cambridge because it was so beautiful. Now, not all their plants are natives, but they had some patches of them. But I'm just wondering, I think that's an opportunity where it's just a big swath of grass normally.
Yeah.
And Mount Auburn made theirs a site for people to go walk through because it was so beautiful. And I'm just wondering if any of the towns that you've heard of besides that have or any towns have thought about putting sections of sort of native plants in the cemeteries.
You know, that's so interesting. And some people only see cemeteries as where dead people are, which is too bad, because I'm a bird watcher, and oftentimes cemeteries are a great place to bird watch. And you're right, it's just plastic flowers in front of some of the grave sites, and it could, and I see people walking there just, you know, hoofing it to get their walks because it's open, it's safe. I think it's a great idea. I don't know of any, but it seems to me that would be a fantastic idea.
I have one more question too. I've heard several times people say, well, you know, don't the gardens have to be a, you know, certain distance apart? It's not going to work if it's not, you know, a straight or, you know, pathway with all these things a certain distance apart. And I'm wondering, is it okay to just start putting some stuff out, and then as people in town start doing it, then you grow the pathway instead of worrying about, do we have
Absolutely
pathway from the beginning?
That's why, absolutely. That's why that map that the Google map that I showed you with all the dots on it.
Right.
We had a plant sale here and we sold kits, pollinator kits we sold 70 pollinator kits. We got the addresses of all those people and we populated that map. And all of a sudden you go, wow, wow, all these people are participating. Now they only had 38 little plugs, but who cares? They're interested enough to come out to pick the right habitat they needed for the plugs. That was Amy's sale, the other Amy. So yeah, that's why I call them anchor plantings. I never really kind of drew where the pathway. I hope we get to that spot. And David Weber's idea he's the one who was going to hand out letters to people. What a great idea. Yeah, what a great idea. Probably a few neighbors in each neighborhood have, you know, they talk over their fences and say hi to each other. Hey, you want to put together, I'll help you plant some pollinator plants if you come over and help me. I mean, it's such a great social.
Where did you get the pollinator plugs?
Well, we got them from different places because the professional, the landscape designer, Owen Wormser, who organized a couple of those plantings, he's a professional, so he could get bulk plants at an inexpensive rate at the end of the season.
Right.
So Amy, do you have any ideas on that?
Yeah, I have a couple ideas. One is I'm in Cambridge. There's a garden club here that helped coordinate a native plant plug sale through the high school with an environmental club. And they ordered the plugs from North Creek Nurseries. So, you order, I think by early winter, tell them what you want, you get them at a really reasonable price. So if a lot of people are buying together, you can get some really good deals. And I also just wanted to respond to what Carol said. Actually, I'm in Cambridge and I learned how to do citizen science surveys at Mount Auburn Cemetery, looking at insects visiting flowers. And then during the pandemic, the cemetery closed for a while. And so we did it on our streets. So I have this big native garden. And so I'd spend an hour going up and down the street looking for insects and flowers. I saw almost none in my neighbors' yards because almost no one had native plants. And then in 10 minutes in my garden, I saw gazillions of insects. So, and I had now it's spread. There's more people growing native plants, but I think wherever you start, it's going to benefit the wildlife. And then you'll inspire other people. So like the pathway is an ideal, to have really connected habitat, but wherever you start is going to be helpful.
Right.
I would really recommend you at least glance at the Great Barrington Pollinator Action Plan, because one of the drawings in there is it's concentric circles that show how far each kind of bee travels. Like there are 400, we have almost 400 native bee species in Massachusetts, and people go, what? I thought there were like 5. But the tiny little bees can go about 10 yards. The honeybees can go 2 miles. So by seeing how far each of those bees, I had a hummingbird in my garden today, and as soon as it finished with my plants, it just took off like a lightning. It went like 200 yards. So they can find stuff. They can.
I was thinking about pollinators today because I don't know about where you are, Peggy, but here in Stow, we're probably going to hit 32 degrees tonight.
Ah, yes.
And I was thinking of, the bees and pollinators have been out and pretty active. But I bet they're taking cover tonight.
I think in New England, they're used to that. I mean, even before we started seeing all these changes in climate, there'd be freezes late in the spring. So I think they have places to go hang out.
Any other questions from folks? Okay, well, I guess we can say thank you. We've got a lot of work to do. We've got some great references, and I appreciate that a whole lot. We'll be working on putting some of this together by June 3rd when we have the Spring Fest. So
It sounds like a blast. June
and
3rd.
we're looking forward to also putting a pollinator garden in front of the new library. So that's a couple of years away, but it's coming.
Oh, well, start lobbying early
We're
because once
getting there, right?
yeah.
This was me lobbying to the library.
Oh, Randall Library.
I'm pushing on an open door, so that's
I
okay.
think there's a perfect spot for it. I do. I have plans already because we're putting in the Head Memorial Garden too that's currently in front of the library. So
I strongly recommend you put little feelers out for for professional landscape designers
Hmm.
who might want to volunteer and help put together a simple pollinator plan. Because if you just go to a nursery, they'll have big signs that say pollinator plants, and they might not be the best pollinator plants. So somebody who can kind of figure out, and Amy can tell you more, maybe at a different time, about the list she helped to, what do I want to say? Cultivate the big spreadsheet. I'm trying not to use the word spreadsheet, but a really extensive list on some great pollinator plants, and each kind of plant that needs what color it is, how much water they need, what kind of sun they need, what it feeds on. So that's a resource that you can get from the Massachusetts Pollinator Network. And I wish you all great luck. It's a lot to look forward to.
Looks like Carol has something to say.
Yeah, I don't know if you're aware of this, locally, Lincoln Land Conservation Trust every
Absolutely.
year has a sale, and it's
Mhm.
pollinators. And I noticed this year they had native plants, but this year they had specific bunch of different categories that you could buy, different
Good.
options, and they were, some were specific, like these pollinators like this, and these pollinators like this, and shade versus sun, and they sold out very quickly, but they're another resource for this kind of thing.
Yeah, Grow Native Massachusetts is having a native plant sale on June 3rd also. You could check their
Uh-huh.
website for that.
Yeah, we're at Springfest.
Ah. Well, it's the whole weekend. I think it's Friday through Sunday.
Okay, great.
Great.
Mm.
Well, thank you. This has been great. Thank you for your time, Peggy. It's been great to meet you. I will look forward to meeting you someday, stumbling across that bridge of flowers.
Or maybe you can invite Amy and I to come help you plant that pollinator garden outside of Randall Library.
Yay!
Yeah.
We've got 100 plugs to put in front of First Parish Church this June, just in case you're looking for a practice.
My fingernails are already looking like garden fingernails, so. All right, good night, everybody.
Good night. Thank
Night.
you all. Bye-bye.
Bye.